Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed. Hi, welcome to Writers in Focus. Today I have as my guest Dr. Carolyn Newton-Curry, Ph.D. May I call you Dr. Curry?
Yes.
I'd like to welcome you to the Atlanta Fulton Public Library and the Fulton County Government Center. By way of introduction, we're here to talk about your fantastic book. It's called Suffer and Grow Strong, The Life of Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas, who was born in 1834, died in 1907. Dr. Curry has taught at the Westminster Schools in Atlanta and at the University of Kentucky. She is the founder and chair of Women Alone Together, a nonprofit foundation created to meet the needs of women who are alone in our culture. We'll talk about that. She met her present husband in College Park, Georgia in 1951 during their 6th grade together. His name is Bill Curry, and he had something to do with football over the years. I forget. We're here to talk about this remarkable woman, Carolyn Newton-Curry, and I'm trying to think of how I want to begin this interview. I read somewhere on your blog that years ago it was either you or a sister or a cousin were accused by a father of having some vinegar in you, some gumption. Is that a good place to start?
That would be a wonderful place to start. Actually, that's a story about my mother, who, if you know my mother, she's what we would call a strong-minded woman. She says what she thinks. And when she was a little girl, she spoke up at school when she felt like her aunt had usurped a privilege that her mother had of piecing a quilt and presenting it as a gift to the teacher, which she was excited about. And she just observed it at school, didn't say anything, but then when she went home, she got off the school bus and she walked straight to her Aunt Estelle's house. And she was about 6th grade or something like that, but she went right up to her aunt and said, "I know what you did today. That was wrong. You shouldn't have done that." And then she turned and left. Well, that night, when she got home, here comes Aunt Estelle up the road. She's going to tell on her. And she told my grandfather this story, and she said, "Now, Frances was disrespectful. She should be punished. She was sassy to me." And he listened. And then when Aunt Estelle left, he leaned over to Mother and he smiled and he said, "You got a little vinegar in you." And that is, I say, finding your voice. Women have had to learn to speak up because in the 19th century and early in our history, women were told that they were to hold their tongue, be silent, be in the background, and not speak up.
Let's talk about Carolyn Newton-Curry because that's you. Let's talk about Ellen Gertrude Clanton Thomas. Explain to the audience how, well, you were working on a Ph.D., and if I recall, you needed a suitable subject. You were what I would call, and we're not that far in age, but in the 60s and 70s, there wasn't really feminism. You were proto-feminist. You were tired of hearing about, and women got the right to vote in 1920, and women did this, and blah, blah, blah. You literally searched for a subject for a dissertation and found Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas, a daughter of Georgia. Who was she? Get the ball rolling for me.
Well, yes.
Because she's unbelievable.
Yeah, she is. She's a real treasure.
Yeah.
And what I want is for Georgians to know her name.
Yeah.
We should celebrate this woman because she was so outstanding. And when I was in graduate school in the 70s, that was the beginning of the women's movement in our country. We were talking about women's rights. And in classes, we didn't have women's studies courses. We didn't have women's history classes. So every time I did a paper, I would do it on a woman or a women's issue. This was through my master's and my PhD. And then when I got ready to select my dissertation topic, I was told, be sure to get something that you have a passion about, get an interesting topic, find someone or something that will hold your interest over several years, because you put so much time and energy into doing a dissertation. So I knew from the beginning I had to find an interesting woman, and I was hoping I could find a Georgia woman. And then if you're going to write a biography of a woman's life, do you have the source material? There's the catch. And because these women were private, how do we find out about them? I was very fortunate in that I had a professor, John Matthews, at Georgia State University. His wife was a librarian at Emory, and he knew about this diary. This woman, Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas, started a diary when she was 14 years old and kept it for the amazing length of 41 years.
That goes from 1848 to 1889.
Yes.
And wait a second, 13 volumes?
Yes.
450,000 words.
Yes, yes. It is a treasure. And I was able to obtain a typed manuscript. The historian Mary Elizabeth Massey hired graduate students and typists to copy the diary, thank goodness. And I was able to purchase a copy and bring it back to Atlanta with me from Duke. And the diary at that point had never been edited, never had been published. And so I was working and did write my book from the original manuscript. And then Duke recommended, well, you should check her relatives. She's got some relatives in Atlanta. Her great-granddaughter lives in Atlanta. Incredible. And then when I went to visit Gertrude Threlkeld Despo, lo and behold, she was a cousin of my 7th grade teacher. So that gave me some credibility. And she had 15 scrapbooks that her great-grandmother had kept. And she allowed me to take those scrapbooks home with me and keep them for several months. And I said, are you sure you want me to take these scrapbooks? They're such a treasure. Because when she quit keeping the diary, she started keeping these scrapbooks, and she cut newspaper clippings out of the newspaper and glued them very meticulously into these scrapbooks. So if you study the scrapbooks, you could put together her life after she quit keeping the scrapbooks. And this was when she entered the public phase of her life, where she was working in the Women's Christian Temperance Union and eventually in the suffrage movement. So that was just a treasure trove of information. And those scrapbooks are still in the hands of her descendants. Her great-great-grandson has them in Easley, South Carolina. I recently went up and visited with him. So I had these 2 fabulous primary sources. And then I spent a lot of time in the court records in Richmond County. And that was fascinating because I learned really how her family helped to build Augusta and how her father became so fabulously wealthy.
Dr. Curry, let me interrupt right now because not only did you find this treasure trove of what do we call primary sources, you're a historian, trained, PhD, and yet the story itself, the subject, Gertrude Clanton Thomas, reads like a Hollywood screenplay. It kind of, I know, I'm a Yankee, okay? I know Gone with the Wind and Scarlett O'Hara, but she's of that ilk. Could you describe, take your time, but describe to the manner born, how this was unbelievable.
Well,
a 24-room house,
yes.
3 stories high with.
Well, and that was only one of their houses.
They weren't plantation owners. Wait a second.
They did.
What I'm trying to say, they owned many plantations.
That's right. Her father owned 6 plantations.
That's incredible.
And each plantation had thousands of acres of land. Yeah. And then they owned this big house in Augusta where they lived, the 24-room mansion. But then he owned warehouses in Augusta where he stored his cotton. He had rental property that he was renting out to other people. And the amazing thing is that her father, Turner Clanton, really accumulated that wealth in one generation because his father, he was born in Virginia, but came down to Georgia from Virginia, and his father started purchasing land. And then he added to the land purchases that his father had begun. He inherited some property from his wife when he married her. She came with some land and some slaves. But it was just such an opportune time after the invention of the cotton gin.
Yeah.
The soil around Augusta was so rich and so good for cotton cultivation.
And the river was navigable.
The river, and then they could take the cotton to Augusta, and then they could send it out to ports and make that huge profit that was being made off of cotton at that time. So he was in the right place at the right time, you might say, but he was also truly a good businessman.
Yeah.
And,
we have to talk about ownership of property and slaves. He owned 393 slaves. That's remarkable.
Yes.
And when I say remarkable, explain to the audience what I mean. That's a lot.
That was a lot, because at that time, if you owned as many as 20 slaves, you were considered a planter. Slave ownership was actually going down, but they had to have a labor source to work those thousand. He owned 12,000 acres of land. And so, as unfortunate as we know today that slavery was, that was his labor source. And I think he was one of the more benevolent slave owners, if we can say that.
I know what you mean.
Because of the description of what kind of man he was and how much his daughter adored him. I think he was a good man, but nonetheless, he did benefit from free labor.
These were the times he was raised in.
Yes, yes. And then, of course, that was the problem once the slaves were emancipated and Gertrude and her brothers and sisters inherited all of this land.
I want to go, Dr. Curry, I want to go back.
Okay.
I want to go back because the story is so remarkable. The father saw something in his daughter, Ella Gertrude Clanton. Not even the firstborn, I don't think.
No, she was the second daughter.
But in 1851 or 1853, it was unthinkable anywhere in the world for a father to send his daughter to college. And he sent his daughter to the first women's college in Wesleyan in Macon.
Well, the thing I admire about him is that he recognized her passion for reading and writing. She was very intelligent, and she wanted to keep this diary and started. She loved to write. She loved to read, and then in the diary she would talk about what she'd been reading. And she was always
reading the same stuff I read in college.
And she was always asking her father to get her some more reading material. So this man, who lived in a generation where the majority of people did not think women need to be educated. Right. That's the remarkable thing. He recognized her intelligence, and he made a special trip to Macon to visit this new college for women that had been started in 1836. And Wesleyan in Macon is very proud of the fact that they are the first college established primarily for women in America.
It is remarkable.
Yes, and I go into one of the chapters and I talk about what the women studied, and they really made an effort to teach them the same thing that they were teaching the boys, the young men at Emory, which became our Emory University today. And even though they were young, she went when she was 14 and graduated when she was 17. It would probably be something like an advanced prep school today, but it was a beginning.
Oh, sure.
And as I said in the book, she went and she lived there. She boarded for several years. She had all that experience, and it was an opening for her, opening a door for her that she never closed. She kept reading. She kept asking questions. She kept being curious and wanting to know how things worked in the world. And she was very proud of her education, and it allowed her to start a school in her home after the war.
See, this reads, Dr. Curry, it reads like a novel to me, because I'm going to ask you about, well, certainly did she get married? Did she get married to that Princeton guy? But
yes.
Your book is, the audience has to know this, it's the work of a professional historian. It's based upon these voluminous diaries. So what you're reading is basically the truth. It's not just a verisimilitude. This really happened, and you have the footnotes to back it up. But this guy, I talk about J. Jefferson.
He was, by family tradition, he was a very handsome young man. He was a good horseman, a good marksman.
Yeah.
And I'm sure she was very taken with him. She met him while she was going to Wesleyan. His family lived in Burke County, and they were of the planter aristocracy too. Her future husband's father owned several plantations and had wealth in slaves, but it was nothing compared to her father. But nonetheless, he was of that privileged class. And the year after she graduated from Wesleyan in 1851, she gets married in 1852. And she's 18 years old, and she has to persuade her father. And she doesn't go into detail. Why was Turner Clanton, her father, this brilliant man, reluctant for her to marry J. Jefferson Thomas?
He's a smart guy.
Well, as one historian said, he probably saw the handwriting on the wall.
Right.
But, he probably was worried about their financial future. Maybe young Jeff had already started drinking. Family tradition says that he does have a drinking problem and that it got worse as through the war and everything. So for whatever reason, her father was reluctant, and they were so close, and she was so talented, and he would naturally be cautious. But he finally consented, and once he consented, he was very generous. She got her trousseau from New York. He gave them land, and he set up a separate estate for her, and wrote in that separate estate that her property was not to be liable for her husband's debts. And this was a new thing to establish a separate estate for a woman, because back in that era, when a woman married a man, everything she owned went to the man, naturally. And her father was trying to protect her from that. And that's a big part of the book. It's a long story, what happened to her wealth.
It's incredible.
But then at 17, here she is. She graduates, she gets married at 18, and then she starts having children. And she says that's when her troubles began. And it was so astounding. She probably leaves us the best record of what women went through in childbirth.
It was gut-wrenching for me to read this. I mean, 10 children, 7 survived, and she's
7 survived. One survived till 7 years of age, but anyway, at the end, she had 6 survive.
Unbelievable.
And she is very honest. She pours her emotions into the diary. And I have counselors now who tell me, today they say write it, speak it, cry it. Anything horrific happens to you, it's very healthy to journal. So what she was doing, her writing and keeping the diary, was a very therapeutic thing. And when things were bad, that's when she wrote the most. If she lost a child, if the war was going poorly, if something happened with her family, she pours her thoughts in there.
Let's not forget that war of Yankee aggression that she and her family lived through. But I want to fast forward. When I worked at the University of Georgia Libraries, people would come in from all over the world to look at these first editions of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. And being naive and being a Yankee, I said I thought the book was about the South and the Confederacy and slavery, and I was corrected. The Scarlett O'Hara story is about survival. This book is about survival, isn't it? I just wanted to be clear on that.
Yes. Well, it's someone asked Margaret Mitchell one time, what was the theme of Gone with the Wind? And she said, well, if it has a theme, it's about survival. And why do some people survive horrific things and other people are destroyed? And in Gone with the Wind, Scarlett survives by hook or crook. Grit, determination, gumption. That wonderful word that came out of, I guess, Gone with the Wind. I think Margaret Mitchell used that expression right then. Yes, she had gumption. And I say that Gertrude had that same grit, determination, gumption. She survived all these childbirths, even though she would go through horrible depression. and almost died, certainly one time, and maybe more than one time. But she had that drive and determination. And then when the war came and they lost everything, she started looking for a way that she could help the family economic situation. You know, she said, well, what can I do? I can teach. I can start a school. Right. So she starts a school.
Which was unheard of, too.
Yes.
She's Southern white aristocracy.
Yeah. A Southern lady,
yeah.
a woman of her class, would never have worked.
Yeah.
She would never have thought of working before the Civil War. But it was necessary, and that happened. A lot of women in the South did that. The men all left. Many men did not come back from the Civil War. And of course, many women were not as wealthy as she was, and they all had to find what resources they could find. They had to run the farm. They had to start the school. They had to do whatever they could. But in her case, she decided to start a school, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but her husband helped her build the school because he had bought a substitute during the war.
For $300.
Yes.
That's not talked about a lot,
yes,
is it? But
no.
if you were rich, Yankees could do it too, but
yes,
for $300,
it was done on both
you
sides.
could buy a substitute. Yeah.
Up through 1862, you could buy a substitute for $300. And it's amazing. Many people don't know that. Several people have said, oh, yeah. I've never heard of that. I said that to a man the other day, and he said, you mean he bought a substitute wife? I said, no, that's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They brought substitute soldiers, a soldier to go fight for you, and he came home. She was embarrassed about that because she really believed in the Southern cause. But she was not one of the women who did not have a husband after the war.
Right.
She did have a husband. What kind of shape he was in.
A professional Confederate imposter. Right.
He was really broken by the war. He did try to start a business after the war. He tried to make a go of planting. He tried to hire laborers, but money was in such short supply.
You went easy on him, Dr. Curry.
Well, I'm just trying to give him.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I think he did try. But he was not successful. His drinking increased. She talks about arguing with him, and he used profanity. And, you know, she just really was irritated with him. But she was a good Methodist woman, and she didn't believe in divorce. So they never divorced or separated. But toward the end of the book, and really all of their life later, I think she went her way and he went his way.
Pretty obvious, yeah. That 8-year gap or lacunae in the book. She ends up, and this is one of your big things, Dr. Curry, she ends up an independent woman finding her own voice. Very, very moving. Talk about, we don't have much time left, but she became a Women's Christian Temperance Union person. We see them parodied in movies, and it wasn't like that. But talk about how the WCTU evolved into a movement for universal suffragism.
Well, women in the South did not have the abolitionist movement that women in the North had. That's how suffrage got and the women's rights organizations got started in the North. But in the South, women started in their church groups. They learned they could organize, they could make money. They went into all these volunteer groups like the Daughters of the Confederacy, etc. But the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which started in the North but found fertile ground in the South, was very, very popular. She got involved through Jane Sibley in Augusta, and she became president of the Augusta district. Ella Gertrude did. And it was proper for a woman because they could put on their hats and their gloves. It had Christian in the name, but they were fighting alcohol, but they were also, if you read their material, they were concerned about the women that were abandoned because of drunken husbands, women who didn't have the education to make a living. They were really concerned about the well-being of women.
And they were learning organizational skills, administrative skills.
Yes. And then when they went to the legislature and tried to get the legislators to change the laws, and they were looking at blank faces, they realized they didn't have any power, and they were going to have to get the vote. So they started to organize the suffrage movement in Georgia, which came late and took a lot of courage because they were ridiculed from the clergy. The Atlanta papers, when they had their conventions, they made fun of these women. But Gertrude was in that small number of women who had the courage to just keep working until in 1899 she was elected president of the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association, the first time they met in convention. And when you look at her life, it was an amazing transformation from this privileged, protected, wealthy young lady through all of this transition in her life, so that at the end of her life she devotes herself to working for women's causes, and she really was trying to better the world of women. And I think she was happy at the end of her life and satisfied.
She found her voice.
She found her voice. Yes, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've been talking to Dr. Carolyn Newton-Curry, who's written this remarkable book. It's a work of history, it's a work of scholarship, but it reads like a novel. It's called Suffer and Grow Strong, The Life of Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas. It's been a pleasure meeting you. My last question is, very simply, did you have your husband's support?
Oh, yes. My husband has supported me 100%, and he loves this book, and he's traveling around with me to book signings and on this book tour. Yes, he's very supportive.
Dr. Curry, I had to say that with a smile on my face. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been delightful. I've really enjoyed it.
Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed.